Hi, welcome to Education Roundtable. My name is Larry Petraccaro, and Education Roundtable is a program where we will try to explore what's going on in the different schools in the town and in the school district. We're actually kind of trying to resurrect it. It had been a regular show on local television, and I guess over the course of years it's somewhat fallen apart. Or not fallen apart, but kind of fallen off the radar. So my guest tonight is Elizabeth Aaron. She's the principal of Columbia High School, and we're going to speak with her a little bit about her background and how she got into education, and a little bit about what she sees for the high school and what the high school is about. So Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us, and let's start off with a little bit of an idea about you, a little bit of background and some of the reasons that brought you into education.
Sure, and thank you very much for having me. I'm pleased to be here. I graduated from New Jersey Public Schools. I was born and raised in Summit, New Jersey, so I graduated from Summit High School, and my parents are a product of New Jersey's public schools as well. I went to Boston College thinking I would become a teacher and kind of torn between teaching English and teaching history. I took a poetry class where I discovered that probably teaching literature was not my strong suit, and I had some really great history professors, so I discovered very quickly that history was my strong suit. So I student taught during undergrad, majored in history and secondary education, and graduated from college very fortunately with a teaching job at Asbury Park High School. So I spent the first 4 years of my career teaching at Asbury Park High School, and then I spent another 7 years teaching at Summit High School. Then I did some graduate work while I was teaching in education and in history at Kane and at Rutgers Newark. Then I spent about 10 years working for a bunch of different people and places, largely headquartered at Rutgers Newark in the history department, where I've taught in the graduate school for 5 years. I've done some cool stuff working with the Newark Museum, working for the National Endowment for the Humanities. Did a really cool project with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar a couple of years ago. And about 2 years ago, finished up my coursework for a PhD in American Studies at Rutgers Newark, and was just about to start working toward taking exams and reading and writing for exams, and instead found myself applying for a job as assistant principal at Columbia High School. And shortly after that, as of this July, I found myself principal of Columbia High School, which I'm very excited about.
Yeah, and I think we're excited to have you. I mean, it sounds like you've been busy then.
It's been a little busy lately.
Yeah, I mean, so it was history.
It was.
And just to, that kind of intrigues me, because I know I found, when I was younger, which was a long time ago, history seemed so boring until I got out of the classroom environment of history and started to read about it. I got really fascinated with it. I mean, it seems like such a much more, at least to me, a much more dynamic subject than it ever was when it was presented to me in elementary school or even in high school.
You could do a really bad job teaching history. You can, which is a shame, because as I used to say to my students, history is many things, but one of the things history is just stories about really interesting people doing usually really great intelligent stuff or really stupid stuff or really ridiculous stuff. So trying to find the stories where those people are doing those things and trying to help students understand that you don't have to be really famous to make history. It kind of depends how we choose to tell the story. But history to me is really the study of human beings and what they've chosen to do and why and how and when. So if you kind of cast it that way, I find that students can be engaged, because I've never really found anyone who doesn't like a good story.
No, no, a good story. And it's what I found, one of the things I always used to think was kind of interesting, for want of a better word, was how Anglo-centric our sense of history was, at least in the, let's say up through the 12th grade. And again, maybe things have changed, and you can comment if that has been. But it's always seemed to me like Columbus discovered America, then the next thing that happened was the Pilgrims were here. You know,
Right.
there was a whole lot of time
Right.
in between.
There sure was. And there were people here way before Columbus got here. So I think we do a much better job than we used to, and that has a lot to do within, quote, the academy in history. People other than people descended from Anglo-Saxon people deciding that there might be other stories to tell, because one set of stories probably is not the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
And so really, in history, and particularly in American historical scholarship since you could say the 60s or the early 70s, different people from different backgrounds getting into the study and the field of history has yielded some really good storytelling that I think kids find more interesting than maybe they used to.
I would hope so, because
Mm-hmm.
again, I think it's fascinating. You mentioned that you had done something with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Did.
What was that?
He is an historian, which not too many people know about him. He's really smart, and he has written multiple books. One is a children's book about African American inventors who most people have never heard of. It's a beautiful children's book, but he also wrote a book about the Harlem Renaissance, On the Shoulders of Giants. And it's about the Harlem Renaissance, but it's also about the way in which he, as kind of a teenage boy and as a young man, kind of found part of his own identity in learning about the past, and in particular about the Harlem Renaissance and all African American basketball teams in kind of the precursor to the NBA. And the publisher he wound up working with, or the distributor he wound up working with, wanted some people to work on curriculum for the companion movie that was made from the book. And through the history department at Rutgers Newark, they found me, basically. And so I spent some time obviously reading his book and talking with that book distributor and book company and working with some people to develop curriculum. And we basically wrote companion curriculum to go along with that book, and that resulted in me getting to meet him. I think we had 3 separate meetings, one of which was in Washington, D.C. with the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, and the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, and the Undersecretary of Affairs in the U.S. State Department. They were doing they were setting up some international visits for him based on the book and kind of books and history as a way to do diplomacy with other nations, and particularly to connect him and the United States with teenagers in other nations. And so I was just kind of involved in the project that way. And one of the really neat things for me to learn was he was very happy not to talk about basketball. And since I didn't know a ton about basketball, it worked out well. So we wound up talking about things like his children and my children and chess and books and how you decide to take books on vacation and what the pressures are if you wind up on vacation with the wrong books or not enough books. And he's a really neat person and really smart, and it was a really fun thing to do.
Well, you mentioned about trying to use history as a way to, if I understood it correctly, kind of connect with other people, other cultures, and other countries.
Definitely.
How do you do that? I mean, are you trying to? When I say how do you do that, I mean, are you trying to pull out let's say, the history of a different country, or are you trying to get them to maybe understand the history of our country? What was the kind of the?
On that, I suppose both. But on that project, it was particularly, I suppose, really almost an outgrowth of September 11th, even though by the time we did this project, it was probably 2010 or 2010 probably. But it was really about the United States Department of State looking at diplomacy across youth generations and connecting with them. And basketball is an international game, and he's an international figure, and he cares about sports, and he cares about America, and he cares about diplomacy, and he cares about good relationships. So I don't know if the State Department found him or if he found the State Department, but it was just a really neat thing. I don't know what ultimately became of some of the planning for the visits and things. That was beyond my part of the project. But I think it was about helping people see more of America than maybe they see on the news or on TV.
Well, that could be helpful, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
So you've had some interesting experiences there.
Yeah, that one was a really neat, that was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, yeah.
Well, do you still retain an interest in history?
Yes.
I mean, do you read it?
I do read it. Haven't read it too much since the school year started. I've been mostly reading for school. But I did my coursework for my PhD in American Studies is about Newark and the Newark public schools at the turn of the century. And so my own research, when I can do it, which I'll hopefully start doing more in January, is about immigrants who came to Newark and kind of schools around the era of, say, 1900 to 1915, which is when my father's family was coming to Newark from Italy. And my mother's family didn't come to Newark, they came to Boston and New York. But so yeah, my interest in the way we study the past, the way we talk about the past, the way we either learn from the past or don't is still pretty strong.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes, you want the past, I presume, to be a guide, not an anchor, right? You want it to move you on. I guess we should also talk about the high school.
We could talk about that, talk about history. It's a very historic place. I love it. It's a great storied institution. It's got a long and distinguished history, so
well, since
that
we're
appeals
talking
to
about
me.
history, tell us a little bit about that.
Now I'll get my date wrong, but I think the history of public education in South Orange Maplewood dates to about 1812 or 1814.
Really?
I think our very first schoolmaster, as it were, I think is about 1812 or 1814 or so. So that's pretty cool, quite frankly. And of course, this building dates to about 1928, 1929. And not that famous people make your history, but sometimes they do. And there are some very accomplished people who come through here, which I think is a pretty great thing for a high school to claim. And a good thing for kids and for teachers to think about whose stories have come through this building and how have those people gone on to shape other people's lives. And I think that is really respected in this community, in our towns, and in the building. We think alumni are important. We have an Alumni Hall of Fame. We have an induction ceremony every year, and people said to me last year when I was here as an assistant principal, you're really going to like this. This day is pretty cool, and it is something I'm not sure any other high school can claim. It was a really neat day. The Hall of Fame induction day becomes a whole day where the honorees come and their families come, and there's a kind of a meet and greet with the student council who puts the whole thing together, and there's a luncheon and a whole school-wide assembly for them to be inducted, and the induction ceremony involves videos and clips from high school yearbooks and maybe quotes from people they've worked with, and it's really a remarkable way to honor the work that graduates have done.
Well, how many alumni are in the Hall of Fame, roughly?
It's on the wall in the library upstairs. Roughly 50. That might be a bad estimate. 2 a year, and I'm not sure to what year the Hall of Fame dates. 80s, I think. I don't want to be quoted and be wrong, because historians should not be quoted and be wrong, but about that.
Yeah.
About that. And we really, I think our school, when the student council begins the process of collecting names and suggestions and doing some research, I think they really consider carefully, like, what have people done, and how did their life here at Columbia have a role in what they became.
So
kind of how did they show the roots of who they would be.
So the student council actually picks?
The student council does. There's a whole process by which they collect names and suggestions, and they do research on those people, and they reach out to maybe people who've known them. And one of the important things is that the alumni be available to come. You can't be inducted in absentia, I don't think.
Okay.
So, and that I think also kind of shows a commitment on the part of the inductees. The inductees last year, one was local, but one was living in California, and he came back.
And who was that?
Ahmad Best was his name.
Oh, he was, I think he
He's
was
an actor
in
and
Star Wars.
performer. He was?
He was Jar Jar Binks,
He
wasn't
was.
Okay.
He was.
Well, we have to take a break for a moment if we may. And,
Sure.
So if you'll just stay with us, we'll be back in a minute.
Television is a powerful and influential medium that allows different groups the opportunity to produce programming that directly affects their own communities. Public, educational, and government access channels ensure that all people, regardless of race, age, gender, disability, religion, or economic status, have access to local government information and the use of a public communication forum. Make sure everyone has a voice. Support your local PEG channels.
Hi, welcome back. I'm here with Elizabeth Aaron, the principal of Columbia High School, and we've been talking, basically we've been talking about history, as it turns out, a subject that Elizabeth had studied and is still an interest of hers, and which is interesting because it turns out to be an interest that I have as well. But to talk a little bit about the school, in terms of being a principal, I know you'd been a classroom teacher. You'd mentioned that at the beginning when you gave us a little bit of a background about you. But do you think that sometimes you can be too close to understanding the issues and problems that a teacher deals with? And does that make the transition into being a principal more difficult, easier, or how would you see that?
I think I see it as a strength of mine and as something I think it's important for principals and assistant principals to have. I think a very long time ago, one of my colleagues with whom I taught said, "You should be a principal someday." And I said, "Never, not going to happen. I would never leave the classroom. This is too much fun." And he said, "No, you'll be a principal." And he said, "You're such a good teacher, you should be a principal." And that has always stuck with me. I actually saw him last June and reminded him that it had indeed come to pass. So I think you have to understand the classroom, and you have to understand very much the daily lived experience of students and teachers in order to be a good principal. Otherwise, I think you can wind up just running a building.
Mm-hmm.
And running a building is not very interesting to me, because a building is just a framework and cinder block and beams. But running a school is about people, and particularly children, even if they're 17 years old. In some ways, they're still children. So running a school is I think, something that you can't do well unless you have spent a lot of time in the classroom. Because teaching is hard. It is really, really hard. To do it well, you have to work really hard. So I think a principal who's done it for a long time can be a handy person to have as principal.
Somebody to provide some guidance or so. Okay.
To provide guidance and to it's an honor to kind of be asked to consider the big picture, but to remember that the big picture is not what the students who walk in the building in the morning are thinking about. They are thinking about, I have a chemistry quiz, I don't like PE, I forgot how to conjugate my verbs that end in ER, I want a date to the prom. Those are the very much realities of the students who walk into the building, and teaching for a long time helped me really understand that. I like teenagers a lot. I think they're really interesting and fun to work with.
So sounds like you're describing it almost the way you would pointillism or something, the big picture is made up of a bunch of the little details or something.
Yeah, and
I
the little
suppose.
details are people. They're actual,
Yeah,
kids, people with dreams and difficulties and frustrations and hardships and tremendous optimism. And so helping teachers make that all happen in the classroom, I think, is what a principal is supposed to be doing.
Well, then talking about the classroom, I mean, in terms of the various disciplines that, when I say disciplines, I'm talking about like math or science or history or literature.
Yeah.
Are there any that are, you think, most critical for, let's say, success in the 21st century, what kids need to know to navigate? And are there any that you find particularly difficult to staff?
Well, nationally, staffing STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, is more challenging right now than staffing English language arts. We're no different than any other part of the country in that regard in New Jersey. In New Jersey, for example, there's a big shortage of physics teachers. So that's difficult. The larger issue there is that it's just hard to staff teaching in general, as we are seeing, because teaching is not a profession that a lot of talented people are going into for all kinds of reasons that you could unpack for hours and hours in conversation. So my big concern and worry is if we as a nation can continue to attract really talented, high-performing, hardworking people into the profession. And that is a very tricky thing to be doing right now. So that's one of the things that's great about where we are. There are some really great teacher programs here. The director of the teacher education program at Rutgers Newark is part of a statewide kind of consortium on looking at issues regarding teacher training programs and their effectiveness. Montclair State is really well regarded for its teacher training program. William Patterson turns out pretty good history and other teachers. So we're in a good place to be able to attract those teachers. The question is, can we keep them? And that's a question for all of us, not just here at Columbia.
Well, speaking of, you bring the subject up, then what are the keys to retention? I mean, because that's you're right, I don't know that that's particular. Obviously, it's particularly important with teachers because you're dealing with lives, I suppose. But I mean, in other businesses too, they always talk about the ability to attract and retain good people. So, are there any keys or any thoughts you have as to why it might be difficult or what you would need to do to retain the people you want?
I think, the thing corporate America has on us is profits that they can use to attract people, which we don't. So, we can't do things like signing bonuses. And I think starting salaries for teachers is difficult. Depending on how associations and unions negotiate salary guides, there can be lots of money for teachers who are at the middle or towards the end of their careers, but that drives down starting salaries. So in New Jersey, where the cost of living is high, that's really a challenge. And I think I'd really like to see us go to a model in teaching that's not about throwing a first-year teacher in a classroom with 125 kids 5 periods a day and kind of seeing how they do. We try really hard to mentor new teachers, to pair them with a teacher who's been at it a while, but the demands on teachers' days are really pretty significant, and kind of having that breathing time to stop and reflect and talk about how you did and debrief your teaching experiences is something that we don't do it well.
Does anyone
And
do it well?
that's not we, Columbia doesn't do it well, it's
the
we, the
profession.
nation doesn't do it well.
Okay.
The comparison that people have made is doing something more like what the medical profession does, where you kind of ease into a residency, although med residents, I'm sure, would say they don't feel like they're easing into it at all. But I'd love to see something where you could pay someone a half salary to work as a kind of an assistant teacher or a teacher who's being, really mentored and doing like a really intensive kind of workshop residency. And that's something that some programs have done. Montclair State, I think, actually does it with veterans, or they did it for a few years with training veterans. There's an urban teaching fellows residency in New Jersey, I think possibly also at Montclair. Rutgers Newark has kind of dabbled in some of that thinking. So I think there are ways we could do it better than just taking 22-year-old undergrads who have just barely majored in a subject and say, here you go.
Well, teaching at the high school, is that much different than teaching, let's say, at an elementary school? Would you think that or not?
I would think it. I've not ever been brave enough to consider teaching at an elementary school, not for a day. I used to joke with my son's teachers that I would last until about 8:45 on Tuesday morning, and then I would go running for the far hills. It's really different. In an elementary school, you can have the same students kind of all day, but say you only have 20 or 24 of them, but then you're managing 24 completely different people. The high school, you're managing maybe 100 or 125 people. You're a content area expert in secondary school. Our elementary school teachers are more generalists, but some of them have very, deep experience in some content areas, and they start kind of a cluster or a kind of content area model sometimes in 3rd or 4th grade, where someone specializes in reading, language, arts, and writing, and another teacher will teach in science and mathematics or social studies, and they kind of swap within a grade. Mm-hmm. That's how it's worked for my sons at Clinton Elementary. So I would never, I think, fall into the trap of comparing those two jobs because they're so different. And of course, as a high school principal, if our elementary teachers aren't doing a good job, I don't have anything to work with. So the work we do K-8 is really critical for me, that work be done well.
They're passing them on.
Yeah, and they, the elementary years are I think, critical for connecting kids to what school is about and should be about, and how it should engage them in being curious and asking questions and liking school. So they do really important work for us.
Well, backing up again to the high school, how is the high school organized? Like the mechanics of it, is it divided into departments? I know
it is. So Columbia has there's some things that are kind of pretty traditional about the Columbia, kind of the way Columbia is organized. We have a 9-period day. We start at 7:30 in the morning. We end at 3:01. In that 9-period day, students are usually taking 7 classes, and they have a lunch and maybe a study hall. Not all of our students take 9 periods. Many of our students have an 8-period day, so they'll take periods 1 through 8 or periods 2 through 9, which often confuses people not familiar with Columbia High School because it looks like kids are coming to school and leaving school at 4 different times of the day, which they are. I know when I first moved to Maplewood, I thought it was very strange that kids went to school and then 50 minutes later there was another group of kids also going to school, but that's how the day here works. And the content area departments are run by content area supervisors who are either kindergarten through 12th grade or 6th through 12th grade supervisors in special education, instructional and media technology, or career and tech ed, English language arts, science, PE, and health and nursing, social studies, world languages, and ELL, mathematics, I think I named them all, fine and performing arts. And then the state of New Jersey sets graduation requirements, 4 years of this, 3 years of this, 3 years of this, 2 years of this, 1 year of this. And so that's kind of the way we start designing academic programs for students. We have a tremendous depth and range of course offerings here, which is one of the benefits of being large, is we have 21 AP courses, we have a TV production studio, we have a swimming pool, speaking of history. We have great PE offerings, we have remarkable fine and performing arts, we have 3 or 4 periods of band a day. We have an honors chamber choir. We have a women's choir. We have an a cappella group. We have a full school chorus. We have a 9th grade band. We have an honors wind ensemble. There are a lot of opportunities here that don't exist in a lot of other places.
Yeah, it seems difficult just to keep track of all that.
It's a lot.
Well, how many kids are in the high school?
We have right now we have about 1,940.
And how are they broken down from freshmen through?
So the smallest class is the seniors right now, and our freshman class is about 100 students larger than our seniors, which kind of parallels the demographics in Maplewood South Orange, is that our smaller classes are graduating, and the kind of baby boom that was really the post-September 11th suburban metropolitan New York baby boom, those students are aging into middle and high school because it's 2014. So people who kind of moved to the suburbs and had children after September 11th, their students are kind of 11, 12, 13. Yeah.
So what's your projection for, let's say, the maximum capacity you anticipate, or the largest size, I guess is really what I meant.
So Board of Ed projections, I think, peak at somewhere between about 2,250 and 2,300 students for Columbia. In which year, I can't remember, it might be about 1920 or 2021. Again, I'd have to look for sure. That's all on the Board of Ed website. We've had that many students at Columbia before. To many people, that sounds like a terrifyingly large number. Where will you put all the children? But we can and could manage those numbers of students. It will take some interesting planning in terms of how we schedule students, how we use the building, what we do with some of our facilities during the day. I see it as an opportunity to really think about what the school day looks like for students, but whether or not there's actually room for them isn't really my worst worry. There's room for them.
Yeah, well, it's a big building, and there were a whole lot of things that you and I talking about, but I'm afraid I've kind of let that get away from me, and we're just about out of time. We've got about 14 seconds left, so if in that amount of time you have any last things you want to say.
I'd say don't be a stranger to Columbia High School. Come see a performance, come visit our art gallery. When you see our students, ask them about school and how they're doing. It's a great place.
Elizabeth, thank you very much. And thank you for joining us on Education Roundtable.